And this is great because not only there's a lot of funding for science, but there's a lot of powerhouse data and minds behind the underlying science in this. So what's a little unfortunate is that we need a similar effort, but focused on our own planet. Because currently, as ecologists, there's a lot we actually don't know. And it's kind of surprising that we don't know this. We don't know how many species are actually on Earth. We don't know where all of them live. We know where some birds and some charismatic mammals live, and that's effectively it. We don't know how they're going to respond to climate and land use change, but then more important, because we are living in a time of change now, we can't really say much in terms of how the biosphere is going to change. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today. So what I'm showing you here is actually the heartbeat of the Earth. Right? So if you were to measure the metabolism of the biosphere, it would look something like this. And so what you're actually looking at is scrolling through each month of a year, and we're looking at the gross primary productivity. That is how much photosynthesis is being performed then on the planet. And it oscillates like this because you're looking at the different seasons in the southern and the northern hemisphere, right? So you're looking at fall and winter, spring, and so on, right? As it progresses then through the year. But this is the metabolic heartbeat of the Earth. Right? And what this is ultimately reflecting is the metabolism of photosynthesis all across the planet. But then also all of that photosynthesis, that heartbeat, is fueling everything in the biosphere. All the respiration of all the mammals, all the birds, all the insects is tuned to this metabolic heartbeat then of the planet. Okay? And so what we want to know ultimately is what's going to happen to that heartbeat in the climate change. So I'm going to be talking a lot about big data tonight because we're talking about planetary scales. And in particular, when you think of big data in biology, maybe you've heard of bioinformatics. Right? You can get your genome sequence now, right? You can take a swab and send it in and learn about your ancestry, right? And so a lot of that data associated with bioinformatics is relatively clean data, right? Just a bunch of genome stuff, a lot of A's and T's and G's and C's if you remember your basic biology. It's basic building blocks of DNA and RNA. Pretty straightforward. Now with computers and sequencers, that's pretty easy. But for ecologists, that is those of us interested in studying biodiversity within the biosphere, our data is a little different. That is, we don't have kind of set standards, and we work in really different places all across the planet. So biodiversity data are really different in many ways. They're very heterogeneous. They're very different from different methods, different places. Oh my gosh. They're even from students like this where you have to check what they're recording because sometimes it's wrong, right? And again, we work in many different locations. But this is how we measure biodiversity. So these are field data coming from different studies, different organisms and ecosystems. And effectively, our data now goes back, decent good data, back to around 1600s, 1700s. And since that time, we've now been steadily amassing a lot of data across the planet. And again, they come from situations like this. In fact, these are some of the places we work. Here we're recording data in the field. But museums and collectors. Okay? Museums are tremendously important now in terms of where we are obtaining our data in terms of understanding biodiversity. Right? And so museum data, absolutely critical. So what I'm showing you here is the growth of biodiversity data over time. So this isn't genomic data, but this is the observations of different species, different individuals across on the planet. And one of the facilities that does this is something called GBIF, which is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And this summer, we just surpassed 1 billion observations. And wow. This is actually growing now exponentially, right? Thanks to a lot of citizen science, but also the digitization of all of our different data. So 1 billion species, 1 billion observations across the planet. So we're now struggling to put all this information together so that we can have a comprehensive view of biodiversity, but also the health of the biosphere. And so what we want to do is map and forecast the fate of all species on the planet. Can we actually do that? Can we be like the weather people, right? meteorologists who actually try to forecast the weather. Can we do the same thing for species? Every species, every single species on Earth, can we actually do that? Well, microbes may be tough, but what about insects? What about plants? What about all the mammals, all the birds? And I'll let you know, we're starting to do that right now. Can we then zoom in on specific places like the Amazon? Can we forecast how the biosphere is going to change in a time of climate change? So here are 3 initiatives going on right now at the University of Arizona. Something known as the Bridging Biodiversity and Conservation Science Program that brings in postdocs then from around the world to try to deal with these issues. We have several groups dealing with big data and biodiversity and eco-informatics. But we also have a lot of work dealing with theory and models to try to put all this together, to try to make sense of the patterns that we're seeing. So a lot of different people take place in this work. So here's just a smattering of some of the students and some of the wonderful folks that I get to work with in terms of doing this work. So what I'm showing you here is a global map of the density of observations. Okay, so we take all those billion observations and then put them then on a map. And so the color then indicates how densely sampled some sites are. So the bluer the color, the more samples. And so the less blue, the less samples. So we still have areas of the planet where we don't have really good, reliable bits of information in terms of what actually is occurring down there. And other parts of the planet, such as actually with North and South America, parts of Australia, bits of Africa, Europe, we're doing pretty good. But this is growing now exponentially, right? And that's good news. So here's where we work. This is the Texas Advanced Computing Center, where we now farm out a lot of our computation, but increasingly we now do this at the University of Arizona. This is the Ranger cluster. Because it's Texas, they like the name. There's supercomputers, Ranger, Longhorn, let's see, Lone Ranger. There's a bunch of Texas-style names here. So here what we're actually doing is we're taking approximately 500,000 plant species across the globe. There's some question marks in terms of, well, do we actually have all the species? Are we overcounting, undercounting? But we're currently modeling the distributions and the biology of 500,000 of these species. And then we're running these species through different scenarios of climate change all at the same time. So we're basically doing weather forecasting for species. So let me show you one of the outputs then that comes from that, from all that information. And we crank them then through we're using some algorithms in these computers, and we're now looking at North and South America. And so you're seeing a color scale there. Right? And so for the first time for plants, now plants are incredibly diverse. These are all land plants, everything from mosses and liverworts, hornworts, angiosperms, flowering plants, pine trees as well. They're all represented here. We have about 120,000 different species here. So this is the first time we've actually been able to map the plant diversity across continental scales. So this is the first time, right? This actually isn't published. So you're viewing something for the first time. So we're plotting the total number of plant species. But one thing that you'll notice is that biological diversity tends to occur in certain places. Now, obviously there's plants all over the world, right? But in certain places, we get an overabundance. So if you notice where it's red there, we're talking about well over 10,000 species of plants within each of those different pixels. So, what have we learned? Well, I'm going to simplify this. Well, most biodiversity is clustered in just a few areas. And that is actually important because if we think about our priorities for conservation, if we think about in a time of limited funding, in a time of limiting resources, where we may want to be disproportionately focused our attention, this helps us make informed decisions. But what's also fun is because now we know, at least in North and South America, where everything occurs, I can give this information to you. So if you want, if you have an iPhone anyways, you can download what we call Plantomatic. You have to have a name like this, right? So instantly, if you hit the botanize button, I can tell you all the plants that grow within 100 kilometers of where you are. I can deliver that information then to you, but I can also deliver it to other people that want to do other things with that information. And so that's fun, so we can explore virtually the diversity of our planet. And so now that's possible. We can now do this. And so this is some some new work that we've been doing with some nice investment from the University of Arizona to do public outreach to biodiversity data. Okay. So we can now serve biodiversity data not only the public, but other researchers easily. There's another thing that we've discovered, and it's been known for other groups of organisms, but here I'm showing you this for plants where the findings are actually quite striking. So what I'm plotting in this simple graph is the number of observations a given species has been observed. Okay? The number of times a given species has been observed versus the number of species. Right? So you can see this is like a J curve, right? And so what this says is that most species are observed just a few times. In fact, this last little bar here, these are the number of species that have been observed only once. We only have one record of them. There are a few species that are observed thousands, in fact tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times. We have a lot of data for a very few number of species, but most species on the planet, it turns out, have only been recorded by a scientist or some person associated with a scientific facility only a few times. So what does that mean? Well, we have about 40,000 species consist of, and I can tell you what this means, because we cut it off, 3 observations or less. So those 120,000 species across North and South America, 40,000 of those species have only been observed 3 times, right, officially. 50,000 species observed 5 times or less. So the take-home message, most species are rare. By far, the vast majority of biodiversity on this planet is rare. You're lucky to even see it. Where are these rare species? Well, now, for the first time, we can look to see where all of these rare species are piling up. And they pile up in very unique places. And so, again, this is important because now we know where we can start looking and what may be influencing priorities in terms of decision making. Now, there's a whole other aspect of science questions in terms of why these certain places, why are these hotspots of rarity, but that's a whole other thing. Okay, so a small fraction of the Earth actually houses most of these rare species. And that's good news, because now we know. So, what have we learned from this exercise? Well, we are now, just now, this is an exciting time in biodiversity science, because now we can put all of this information together and assemble these global data to actually make accurate maps. And now we can understand that diversity is clumped in space. Diversity is mainly an issue of rarity. Those things are rare, hard to observe. But yet we know very little about most species on Earth because they've only been observed just a few times. Okay, so you may be asking yourself, that's great, Brian. Wonderful. Right, what can we do with this? Well, in the last part of my talk here, I want to take you into where we are now. Okay? So now we have a static baseline understanding of where the diversity of life occurs across the planet within the biosphere. Now, other groups are doing this for birds, for mammals, even for fish, okay, corals, and increasingly now for insects. There's a lot of different groups, and we're all trying to pull together all of this information. But now we're living in a time of change, increasing change. And I'm going to try to make this simple because as scientists we really see that there are 3 central drivers to this change. And the first driver is the increasing human domination of the biosphere. The second is obviously climate change. You've heard obviously quite a bit about it. Species and ecosystems are responding to this change right now. This is not something that's going to happen, and it will increasingly happen, but that change is happening now. And then 3, something that we fear has not been emphasized enough because it could possibly be one of the most important changes in terms of the biosphere functioning. And it's something that we call the size downgrading of the biosphere. And that has to do with the loss, disproportionate loss, of the biggest plants and the biggest animals. And I'm going to show you why that's important. Effectively, we're heading into a world where the big things are no longer here. We have a choice. These are the two worlds we're going into. And as a society, we have to make this choice, which world that we want. And it's based on emissions, right? Greenhouse gas emissions. Now, everything now is pointing to these two being two clear realities, depending on how much greenhouse gas is pumped into the atmosphere. By the end of this coming century, we have two types of scenarios, what we call a best case scenario and a worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is when emissions, our current rate of emissions, are not changed. Business as usual. The best case scenario is a dramatic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The two different worlds I'm showing you there, that's the current temperature change compared by the period 1970 to 1999, the average global temperature between 1970 and 1999. So temperatures are going to increase no matter what. The question is, which world do we want? Now, as biologists, what we can now do is I can tell you increasingly what our biosphere is going to look like in each of those different worlds. And increasingly our science now is focused on trying to tell society what biology is going to be like in these two different worlds. And it's up to us to decide what world we want. So, it's not actually a time, for being rather remorse about this, but it's time to face reality. Okay, so human domination of the biosphere. So I'm going to show you an animation. And this is a fun animation. And this animation focused on South America, a little bit of Central America. And what we're looking at is in the red, I'm starting at 1700. And I'm going to fast forward from 1700 to present day. And the red areas are areas of more human impact. Okay? And so you can see, especially in the high Andes, you can see areas then where the Maya, the Aztecs, the Inca were, and some pre-Columbian societies where they were mainly located. And in this movie, it's going to go rather fast. And so you're going to see the red change as humans become increasingly more dominant than on the planet. But then I'm going to also show a yellow area. A yellow area is going to pop in. Those are the protected areas, areas where nature is effectively either set aside or maintained with local peoples. And so let's just loop through this. There's where we are now today. So it's a crowded world, but we can quantify this. So I'm showing you kind of two sets of curves. There's a curve on the bottom, and there's a curve on the top. And it's actually two different curves on the top, two different curves on the bottom. And so what I'm plotting is year, going from 1900, and we're forecasting this out to 2100, and we're looking at the total square kilometers. This is protected areas, or areas where we have some sort of protection of nature. And up above is several different estimates. You can do several different data sources of estimating the total amount of remaining wild or open area. And if you notice, the bottom curve, we're protecting more and more areas, which is great. But the top curve means there's less and less area available. And what's going to happen is that at some point, probably around 2030, 2050, these curves are going to intersect. And what that means is that the world is full. We call this the closing window for conservation. The window is shutting rapidly. E.O. Wilson has a book, famous biologist in Harvard, arguing that for the effective preservation of biodiversity, we need to set aside 50% of the planet for biodiversity. Well, you notice the 50% curve is right here. We've already surpassed that. So the chances of us getting up to 50% are rather slim. Okay? It's going to take a vast effort. Nonetheless, we have choices to be made. And those choices will impact future generations. But this is assuming a static Earth. Climate is changing. Species are on the move. How do we deal with the fact that biodiversity is and will increasingly be on the move as they respond to changing temperatures, changing precipitation? What's great is that we have science to help us guide our decisions. So, species are and will be on the move, and we anticipate where they're going to go. Currently, we're working with a large international group associated with Conservation International, a project called SPARK, Spatial Planning for Protected Areas in Response to Climate Change. And what we're doing is we're taking all of that global data and our access to high performance computing to then start forecasting, start anticipating where species are going to be moving. I'll show you one example here. So we're looking at a Google Earth map. This is in the Andes. I believe this is in Ecuador or somewhere near Peru. And you're following a forecasted geographic range of a given tree species. And we're following it then through time, from present day all the way out to 2060. So we can now anticipate where species are going to be moving in response then to changes in temperature and precipitation. The green areas are the current protected areas. So we put protected areas in certain places because we thought they were important, but species are moving. And so where we have protected areas now may not actually be protecting biodiversity in the future. Another example, same thing. Protected area, species unmoved. Sometimes species may actually move into protected areas, which is, I guess, a winning scenario. So, I'm showing you a map. And on that map, what we're doing is we're plotting these paths. These are geographic paths where the species is moving through the landscape. So we can anticipate these tracks, potential tracks of where species may move. And we can then do this for all of these different species. We can iterate this over and over again. And we can overlay these anticipated movement tracks of species across landscapes. And that's what I'm showing you on this map. So on this map, we can then identify the areas with a few of these network chains, 50 chains, well over 100 of these chains. That is, these red areas, these are common corridors or pathways where we anticipate species to be moving. So the idea here is that if we can identify those areas before the window for conservation runs out, we can then begin to start to target those areas as potential important areas as species will be moving across the landscape. And again, if you notice the time frame on this, we're talking about, in the next 50, 60, 80 years. That's not that long. But that is only mirroring the rate of change that's going to happen. Okay. So what about other applications? So here what I'm showing you is obviously a nice forest. Fun picture of a forest. Well, we can use our simulations and our computing power to then, like a weather map, kind of forecast where one species in particular, this is a western pine species, where it's distributed across the western landscape. But we can now go through for specific species and ask, Under the worst case scenario, what will happen to the distribution of several of the tree species that occur here in the West? And in this project, we looked within Colorado. We were really concerned about the forests of Colorado and what's going to happen to the forests of Colorado. And so then as we flip through between 2011 and 2081, you're looking for this one species in particular. This is Subalpine Fir, this gradual melting then of its suitable areas because it's getting hotter and it's getting drier. The environment then for trees within the West will be shrinking. But what we can do is we can look at these two different scenarios. The worst case scenario, business as usual, emissions continue to increase, or the scenario where we start to dramatically limit greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm showing you those two different scenarios on that graph. We're plotting time, year, from 1980 to 2080 versus the total area of suitable area in the West for forest. Can you tell the difference between those two different scenarios? So our societal decisions, I can tell you what those decisions will be in terms of forested area in the Western landscapes. These decisions make a difference. So I want to just kind of zoom in on one iconic species. These are aspen trees, right? Go up to Mount Lemmon, get great aspen stands up there, at least little ones. And so to try to kind of bring home these points, we're trying to use different simulation or visualization methods to kind of hammer home the point of what our landscapes are going to look like in the not too distant future. So I'm zooming in on one kind of iconic place. This is actually the Roaring Fork Valley of Colorado. And so if you've been to the western part of Colorado, maybe you've been here, there's where aspen, snowmass, and basalt are located. You can see the snow-covered mountains, but then you can also see, now this is actually our simulation data, okay? So this is not a satellite data. We're actually simulating this. In fact, we're using a military-grade simulation platform. It's called Otera. This is the same platform that the Special Forces use when they put on the 3D goggles and they simulate flying into Pakistan and they go out and everything. We can do the same thing, but for ecology. And so we're simulating then these worlds where these trees occur. And so the darker areas are the forested areas, and that's all aspen trees based in our simulations. It actually matches reality very nicely. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through two different scenarios. I'm going to show you this landscape, the worst case scenario and the best case scenario in 2081. Worst case, best case. By 2081, we're predicting that most of western Colorado will lose most of its aspen forest. The forest on Mount Lemmon, unfortunately, most of the nice coniferous forest will likely be gone, if not in the process of mortality. This is the total change in forested cover within Colorado in the two different scenarios. And I don't have to tell you which curve is the best case and the worst case scenario. Best case scenario, we're looking at maybe a 20% reduction in total forested area. Worst case scenario, we're getting close to 40% reduction in total forested area by just 2081. And not to bring out the bad news, but you'll be able to see this from space. So hopefully you can see Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. The darker areas, those are all the forested areas in the Mountain West. We can use our simulation platform to do the same thing. That's what we simulate current forests. And you see the darker areas, okay? That's where we predict forests to be. It's not bad, it's a decent mix. But now let's go on a journey into the future. I can show you what the four corners will look like from space by the end of the century. 4 points here, actually 3 points, so keep your eyes on those points. Best case scenario, so I'm going to toggle back and forth between current and best case scenario. Worst case scenario. Best case, worst case. You'll be able to see the reduction of forests from space. Why? Hotter, drier. It's not the climate for trees. Okay. So the last part. Now I realize that there's a lot of gloom and doom here, but there's a reason that I'm doing this, because there's actually a lot of good news in this. Okay? But we have to understand what we think are the major issues we have to deal with. And so the last aspect of changes in the biosphere is what we call the size downgrading of the biosphere. And unfortunately, this has not received the attention that we think it should. And this has to do with the biggest things on Earth. It used to be that the world was filled with big things. Big trees, big animals. Human activities across the globe has led to the progressive, disproportionate decline of the biggest things. You can map where people have been based on whether or not there are big trees and big animals there. And this has gone on for a while. This is a graph going back to 100,000 years ago in the past. Each of those different curves are different continents. The top graph is actually the oceans. The bottom graph, the continents. And what we're plotting is the mean body mass of animals on each of these different continents. Starting between 100,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago, we see this plummeting of the largest sized animals. It was effectively a wonderful barbecue from what I can tell. There was a lot of, something had to fuel the expansion of peoples across the planet, and it was the largest animals. But this continues today. In fact, this is very new research just coming out. I'm just showing you the 10 most charismatic animals in terms of percent decrease over the last either 20 to 70 years. Animals, okay, that we care about: giraffes, elephants, lions, gorillas. These are the flagships for conservation. Nonetheless, their populations have continued to decrease. And if you really want to get bummed out, I would point you to the World Wildlife Fund Living Planet Report. They've actually just updated this. Between 1970 and 2010, populations of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish around the globe, population sizes have dropped by 50%. We are slowly but progressively getting rid of animals, plants, but in particular the largest ones. That has a big impact on the world. That has a big impact on the functioning of the biosphere, and it's going to have a big impact on the atmosphere. And we don't necessarily know what that impact's going to be. What about trees? There's a cool study that just came out. Someone actually did the task of counting all of the trees on the planet, right? I pity the person who did this, but actually it was a really cool method, so I'm actually silently really jealous I really did this. They estimate that there's 3.04 trillion trees on the planet. What a great number that is. Oh my gosh, 3 trillion trees on the planet. But they also estimate that 5 billion trees are cut down each year.
15.
Since the start of human civilization, the global number of trees on the planet has fallen by 46%. So now there's 3 trillion trees on the planet, but think how many trees there were. Since the rise of human civilization, we've lost 46% of all trees on the planet. However, if we actually look at the data, which trees are we missing? Disproportionately, it's the big ones. So, here's how we're changing ecology. We're taking out the big things. And that is really influencing this network of interactions on the planet. But it's also influencing the metabolic impact of these really large organisms. Because big organisms are really powerful. They disproportionately impact the metabolism of the planet. So, big animals, big trees. So we call these organisms the megabiota. So we're losing the megabiota very, very quickly. Why are big things important? I'm showing you the size of an animal or a plant. In fact, we put plants and animals and for fun, even dinosaurs on this. The bigger the animal, the bigger the plant, the more biomass it produces, the more metabolism it has, the bigger the impact, the more powerful it is. So what do we do when we go in and all of our biggest corporations are eliminated? What happens to our economy?